Okay, so it's 5:30 p.m. here in Europe. So I'm just gonna introduce the seminar today. We have the pleasure to have with us Slobodan Djajic and Murat Kirdar. Both of them have made very nice contributions to the economics of migration literature. Slobodan focusing on an issue that it's also the topic of the paper that they're going to present today. So temporary migration, how people decide how much to stay abroad, what is the optimal duration of their migration experience. They also have earlier joint work, for instance, a paper that came out in 2014 on the Journal of International Economics on the relationship between income at origin and the total immigration rate. So it's really our pleasure to have you with us today. So first, Slobodan is going to introduce the paper and the theoretical model, and then Murat is gonna take over. Slobodan, the floor is yours. You have 45 minutes in total, roughly.
Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you for inviting us. The paper is on purchasing power parity and the saving behavior of temporary migrants. As you can see, there are 4 co-authors in the paper. There is Alpaslan, Alexandra, Murat, and myself. So why should we want to study the effects of changes in purchasing power parity on the behavior of temporary migrants? Well, first of all, migrant saving can be very large in magnitude when compared with aggregate savings in the countries of emigration. To give you an example, for low-income countries, migrant savings amount to roughly 10% of their GDP. Secondly, temporary migration is the dominant mode of international labor mobility in a large number of developing countries. And the third point is that changes in the exchange rate and the price level can be very pronounced in developing countries, as we have seen during numerous crises over the last couple of decades. Thus, an analysis of how movements in PPP affect the saving behavior of temporary migrants is important in understanding the complex relationship between migration and development. So, what is the setting of our theoretical model? Well, we should think of migrants who were recruited to meet labor shortages in Germany during its post-war economic boom. There is typically a single migration spell for these migrants. This tends to be a relatively long duration. Many migrants chose to remain permanently in the host country, but many of them also returned back to their countries of origin. We are going to study the behavior of temporary migrants, and here we draw a distinction between 2 cases. One case is that of an interior solution, whereby a migrant returns to the source country prior to the age of retirement with the intention of continuing to work back home. The second case is a corner solution, in which case a migrant returns at the age of retirement only for the purpose of enjoying more favorable environment for consumption in the home country. The data that we use stems from the German Socioeconomic Panel from 2017, and it turns out that the corner solution is empirically more relevant for migrants in our sample. So in the theoretical discussion today, I'm going to focus on the corner solution. In fact, the paper was focusing much more on the interior solution in its first, in the first stages of development of the paper. But because of the empirical evidence supporting much more the corner solution case, the editor of European Economic Review, where the paper has already been accepted, suggested that we focus on the corner solution and relegate the interior solution case to the appendix. So I'll focus on the corner solution here. What are the assumptions of the model? There is a single individual. The planning horizon begins at the time of arrival in the host country. This is time t = 0. And the planning horizon ends at time capital T plus R, where T, capital T, is the time of retirement and return to the source country, and capital R is the duration of the retirement phase. While abroad, the migrant engages in 2 activities. One is work at the wage W star, and the other is consumption at the price P star. After retirement and return to the source country, there's only one activity, and that is consumption at the price P. And this price is assumed to be lower than the cost of consumption in the foreign country. So P is assumed to be less than EP star, where E is the nominal exchange rate or the price of 1 unit of foreign currency in terms of domestic currency or the currency of the country of origin of the migrant, and P star is the foreign price level. So we assume throughout the paper that the exchange rate and the price level remains constant unless there is a shock to either the exchange rate or one of the price levels. The shock is assumed to be unanticipated, and our migrant is assumed to have static expectations. That is to say, any change in the exchange rate or one of the price levels is expected to be permanent. So what is the problem facing the migrant? The problem is to maximize utility of consumption over the 2 phases of the planning horizon. The first phase while the migrant is abroad from time 0 to capital T, where the migrant consumes at the rate C star in the foreign country. And the second phase is the R units of time that the migrant spends in retirement after return, and it's consuming at the rate C. We, for simplicity, take the rate of time preference and the rates of interest at home and abroad to be equal to 0. So not anticipating any price shock, the budget constraint facing a migrant is given by this equation here. The left-hand side corresponds to the amount of savings which is accumulated until time capital T, until the time of return back to the country of origin. A0 is the initial stock of assets that the migrant has in possession on arrival in the foreign country. That may be negative in the case the migrant is indebted. And the star indicates that it's evaluated in terms of foreign currency. The second expression in the brackets is the total amount of savings accumulated by the migrant while working abroad. It's the difference between the wage received by the migrant in the foreign country and nominal spending in the foreign country over this interval of duration, capital T. Multiplying that by E0, we have the domestic currency value of the savings which are repatriated back to finance consumption during the retirement phase. This retirement phase lasts for R units of time, as I said before. And the right-hand side of this equation gives you the amount of this saving taking place after retirement. In the parentheses, we have income received by the migrant after retirement minus the nominal consumption spending rate. Income after retirement is assumed to be just the pension benefits that the migrant receives as a result of having worked abroad for T units of time at the wage W star. So pension income is assumed to be some fractional alpha of the total earnings of the migrant while living abroad. E0 multiplies that to have the domestic currency value of the pension receipts. So given the budget constraint and the problem facing the migrant, we can look at the solution. First order conditions imply that the marginal utility of consumption divided by the price must be equal across time, including across the 2 phases of the planning horizon. To get explicit solutions to the problem facing the migrant, we take a specific functional form for the utility function. Here we have the constant relative risk aversion form, where theta measures the degree of concavity of the utility function. So we can write then the optimal consumption rate after return as a function of the optimal consumption rate while in the foreign country. And it turns out to be proportional to the PPP relationship. That is to say, PPP times to the power 1 over theta. So the PPP relationship is just the ratio of the foreign exchange rate, the domestic currency price of foreign currency times the price level abroad divided by the price level in the home country. The solution for the optimal consumption rate in the foreign country prior to any price shock taking place, so we're evaluating everything at initial prices, is this equation for C0 star. So at some time phi, which is before retirement, that is to say while the migrant is still working in the foreign country, we assume there is an unanticipated change in the exchange rate or one of the price levels. So by the time this unanticipated change in PPP takes place, the migrant will have already accumulated a certain amount of assets while working abroad. So he's been working abroad for few units of time prior to the price shock and saving at the rate W star minus his consumption expenditure abroad. So he will have this amount of foreign currency already accumulated during this period before the shock. At the time when the shock occurs, the problem for the migrant is to re-optimize the consumption program from time phi to time capital P plus R, given the asset holdings at that moment. Again, we have the first order conditions for the migrant's utility maximization problem that dictate that the consumption rate after return to the home country must be proportional to the consumption rate while abroad in this post-shock environment, where the factor of proportionality is now P1 to the power 1 over theta, where the subscript 1 indicates that we are talking about values of variables in the post-shock environment. The budget constraint facing a migrant after the shock has three elements. The first one, the first term on the left-hand side, is the total amount of assets that the migrant has in possession at the time of the shock. In the brackets, it's the total amount of assets measured in terms of foreign currency, and multiplying that by E1, we have the domestic currency value of the total asset holdings that the migrant has in possession at the time of the shock. The second term gives you the amount of assets that will be accumulated between the time of the shock and the time of retirement and return back to the country of origin. So that's the second term, and the third term is the amount of savings, which happens to be negative, that will be accumulated after retirement in the country of origin. All these subscripts 1 indicate that we're talking about values of variables in the post-shock environment. Only zeros appear here because we're looking at the savings that has taken place prior to the shock. So using this expression for C1, it's already used here. So we have the budget constraint that can be solved for the optimal consumption rate of the migrant while the migrant is still working abroad after the shock, after the price shock or the shock to PPP. Nominal expenditure is P1 star times C1 star. And to determine the effect on consumption and on saving, therefore, of a change in the exchange rate or the foreign price level or the price level in the home country, we just differentiate the optimal expenditure function with respect to E1, P1 star, and P1.
Slobodan?
Yes.
Yeah, can I ask a question? With respect to the PPP, I try to understand, do you assume that PPP is going to hold in the long run? So basically, if you have a change in the PPP relationship, suppose that you have a change in the domestic price level, do you assume that in the long run, the exchange rate is going to adjust so that PPP is going to be restored in the long run and that you have a deviation in the short run? Or what is your assumption? So here you use an absolute version of the PPP.
Right. The theoretical model assumes that the expectations are static. So whatever occurs at time phi, it remains in that position and there is no further change. In reality, of course, what you have is changes in the exchange rate and price levels occurring over time. And what our what our data suggests is that the price level in the countries of origin of the migrant tend to increase more rapidly than the exchange rate in many cases. In some cases, it's the opposite. And so we don't really examine in the theoretical model anything about the evolution of prices or the evolution of the exchange rate or how changes in the price level may affect the exchange rate. If the exchange rate is initially being supported by the central bank and then there is a change in the policy of the central bank, you may have expectations of such a change which can influence obviously saving behavior of migrants. We don't take that into account. The expectation problem, the problem of expectations is extremely difficult to bring into these models if you want to have assumptions that will not be contested. That is to say, anything I tried with expectations in the first drafts of this paper would be highly controversial. So I stuck with the assumption that expectations are static to give a very clean result, and that is that is the way I would answer your question. Okay, so should I continue?
Slobodan?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Giuseppe. Do you have any place for remitting back home? So remittances are usually a reality in migration. Are they in the picture of your model?
Right. Remittances do account for a significant part, but it turns out that the savings of migrants really dominate remittances. I think Murat can tell you a little more about the magnitude of the remittances in relation to total savings. My recollection is that it amounts to something like 10% of total savings. So it's relatively negligible. We did work out in the theoretical model what would happen if the migrant was sending these earnings or savings back home and holding these savings in terms of domestic currency rather than in terms of foreign currency. And that doesn't really affect the results qualitatively. Quantitatively, yes, but qualitatively, no. So it doesn't really matter in terms of qualitative results whether the migrant is holding the currency in the holding his savings in terms of foreign currency or repatriating those savings and holding them in terms of domestic currency. As far as remittances are concerned, they're relatively small in relation to total savings. But we do start with the assumption that it's an individual who is isolated and there's no family that's left behind to take care of. Thank you for the question. So to get to our results after differentiation, what we see is that for the realistic case of theta being less than 1, we find that an increase in the exchange rate, that is to say, depreciation of source country currency of the migrant or increase in the value of foreign currency in terms of domestic currency, that results in a decrease in consumption spending of a migrant while abroad. Correspondingly, that implies an increase in the saving rate. So depreciation can be expected to result in a higher saving rate of a migrant. Depreciation of source country currency can be expected to generate an increase in the saving rate of a migrant while abroad. Similarly, an increase in the foreign price level can be expected to cause an increase in the saving rate of a migrant while abroad, while an increase in the price level of the source country has the opposite effect of reducing the saving rate of a migrant while abroad. What we also observe is that the relationship between capital T and phi plays an important role in determining the magnitude, not the sign, but the magnitude of the effect on saving. So phi is the time of the shock and T is the time of return back to the country of origin. The smaller is that gap between the two values, between phi and T. That is to say, the shorter is the period of time between the price shock and the time of return to the country of origin. The larger is the magnitude of the effect on expenditure in the foreign country and therefore the effect on saving. So this is true for all of the, obviously it's true for all of the price changes. So our main results can be summarized in two propositions. Proposition 1, supposing that theta is less than 1, a migrant saving rate abroad increases in response to home currency depreciation and to an increase in the foreign price level, and it decreases in response to an increase in domestic price level. And proposition 2, that the response of a migrant saving rate to changes in the exchange rate or the price levels at home and abroad is stronger as the number of years until retirement and return migration becomes small. So these are our main results. I used up my time. If there are any other questions, I can address them now or at the end of the seminar. Otherwise, I would turn the floor over to Murat.
I would go on, and then if a question is addressed to you, also when Murat is talking, just jump in and answer to that.
Okay.
So the data that we use is the German Socioeconomic Panel, which started in 1984. It's an annual panel data set, and we use the 2017 version. This includes several samples of immigrants, and it's resampled over the years. We keep the immigrant households, and we define immigrant households as households in which the household head is somebody who arrived in Germany after age 18. Using this household immigrant sample, we put it into household year format. And in accordance with the theoretical model, we keep the observations in which the household head is 16 or lower, because remember, Slobodan was looking at the decision until retirement. Also, in accordance with the model, we draw countries where wages are higher than wages in Germany and where PPP is less than 1 to be consistent with the theoretical model. But we check the robustness to these restrictions. And after that, the resulting final sample includes households from 88 different countries. The two key variables for our study is first, monthly savings, which is the dependent variable. The key thing about this variable is that it is sensitive below 0 because immigrant households are not asked about their savings. So in the estimation, we will account for this fact. The other peculiar information about our study is immigrants' return intentions in this data set. In this data set, they ask about whether migrants are willing to return, and if they do, in how many years. Okay, so, and we have this information at each year in the data. Actually, using this data, we can just look at the intended age at return. And this shows that most immigrants are in fact planning to return at or near retirement age. So this is consistent with what Slobodan showed you in terms of the theoretical model. So Slobodan showed you two propositions. In one, we are looking at the effect of exchange rate and home country prices on the saving rate. And we use this model 1 to test the first proposition. In this equation, S is the monthly savings. ER shows the exchange rate between Germany and the home country. PH is the price level in the home country. X stands for the individual level controls. And we have fixed effects for time and households. Here, according to proposition 1, we expect the coefficient alpha 1 to be positive, a positive effect of the exchange rate on savings, and we expect alpha 2 to be negative, a negative effect of home country prices on savings. In proposition 2, Slobodan showed how the effects of exchange rate and home country prices change with the time to retirement. And we use this specification to test for it. The difference from the previous one is that we have this interaction terms of the exchange rate and home country prices with years to retirement. So beta 2 and beta 4 are new. In addition, we have the interaction of prices in Germany with years to retirement. We didn't have that in the previous equation because it's not possible to identify the effects of German prices with changes over time only from time effects. But here, because it's interacted with the years to retirement, it is possible to identify the interaction effect beta 5. So here, according to the proposition, we expect the coefficient of the interaction term beta 2 to be negative, beta 4 to be positive, and beta 5 to be negative according to proposition 2. So the additional control variables that we use include micro-level variables from our micro-level data sets, such as household income and size, employment status of household head and several members, and we have rich set of characteristics of the household head. Our key variable of interest are three key variables of interest: exchange rate, prices in Germany and in the home country come from the World Development Indicators. We also include other macro level variables to prevent any potential omitted variable bias. We use log GDP per capita of source countries, and we use a political violence index. which also varies across countries and across time.
Excuse me, Murat, I have a clarification question. So the dependent variable is at the household level, right?
Yes.
And the return intention variable is at the individual level. So I'm curious how you deal with the fact that when you have two respondents.
We take the response of the household head.
Okay.
So some descriptive statistics here. We have descriptive statistics at the cross-section level, at the panel level, and some country level characteristics. At the cross-section level, we have just slightly over 2,500 observations and the mean age at arrival at 29. At the panel level, we have more than 10,000 observations. And in these observations, about 37% indicate positive savings. The saving rate, the positive saving rate, I should say, is about 7.6%. But once we condition on households who save, the saving rate is about 20%. Most of these immigrants have their families in Germany, okay? And if you look at the purchasing power parity across observations, it averages just above 2. So just to give you an idea about identification, here we show how PPP changes over time for a selected group of countries. For some countries, they are quite jumpy, as you see, let's say for Turkey or for the Philippines. For instance, with the exchange rate shocks in Turkey in 1994 and 2001, exchange rate jumps by more than 90% in one of them in 94, I think. Here, obviously, when the exchange rate jumps, we could expect prices in the home country to adjust. I mean, if the home country prices were perfected to adjust, we wouldn't expect a change in PPP. So these PPP changes tell us that home country prices do not perfectly adjust, and there's divergence between the movements in the exchange rate and home country prices, and that is important for our identification of the two variables separately. Here, just as a preliminary examination of the relationship between savings and the key variable of interest, we first regress the X and Y variables on year and country dummies. Then we take the residuals and we divide the residuals of the X variable into a number of bins so that we can come up with these graphs. And what they suggest is that, as the theoretical models suggest, they suggest positive relationship between exchange rates and savings, and a negative relationship between home country prices and savings. In the estimation, obviously, we're going to get into details. Because we have a panel data set, we can account for time invariant unobserved heterogeneity. And because of the several zeros in the dependent variable, we use a Poisson fixed effects regression as our main estimator. But we also check the robustness of our findings with alternative estimators, including the Tobit and OLS fixed effects estimators. We cluster the standard errors at the country of origin level because our key variables of interest vary at this level. Because of the way we define the dependent variables, in all models, the parameters can be interpreted as elasticities.
One quick clarifying question. How many countries of origin do you have?
88.
80.
So another thing is that, as Slobodan showed,
Sorry, and another quick question on this, very related. And so, what's the variance in the number of immigrants from these different countries of origin? Is it
many of them are from many of them are from the original 5 guest worker countries, and the second big group is Eastern European countries, but there are also many immigrants from Africa or South America. But the biggest groups are guest worker countries and Eastern European countries.
And what proportion would be these relative to all the others? So is it that, say, I should think that 60% of all immigrants are from these 5 countries, or?
No, not the 5. The guest worker countries, I can't remember exactly, but maybe 30–40%, because we don't have ex-Yugoslavians. We can't have PPP macro level values, so it's actually 4 guest worker countries, so it's less than 40%.
Okay, perfect. Just for me to understand where the variation comes from.
But I guess that Turkish immigrants must drive the action, no?
No. I mean, it's like they are less than a quarter.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Because, see, we here take the 2017 sample. So a referee actually suggested us to take the recent M samples, which also samples recent immigrants. So obviously the proportion of Turks are decreasing in that, in the later waves. If we just took the original guest worker sample, obviously Turks would be much bigger in terms of the fraction.
I also have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
In your sample, you mixed the migrants who intend to return earlier than at the time of retirement, and the other ones, which you covered in your in what Slobodan has showed to us. So perhaps do the results as well hold for those who return earlier, the ones that you put in appendix, I think, for those who have.
Basically, like we're holding all immigrants in our main sample. We're not restricting our sample in any way. Actually, I was just going to explain that. We show the results for the full sample of immigrants. But we also show our samples that are restricted in terms of return intentions. So
could you just tell us whether the theoretical results are also valid for the ones who, because I think
obviously
what I told us is that he covered the case of the migrants who have
obviously
returned.
I mean, obviously for somebody who is not planning to return, the theoretical results apply less. I mean, for somebody who's not willing to return at all, his or her behavior wouldn't be different from that of a German citizen, right? So obviously the theoretical model, the implications are for somebody who's planning to return.
If I may interrupt the discussion, the question about interior solution. Within interior solution, the difference is, a major difference between the results of the corner solution and interior solution is that the timing of the shock does not affect the magnitude of the effect on saving, while in the corner solution it does. Why? Because in the interior solution, the migrant adjusts the time of return rather than consumption. So that there's an adjustment obviously in consumption as well when you have the change in the price level of the exchange rate within interior solution. But the adjustment with the corner solution is through the budget constraint, and the adjustment, some of the adjustment in the interior solution is through the duration of stay in the foreign country. And it turns out that the asset holdings of a migrant do not influence the consumption pattern when you have an interior solution, but influence only the timing of return. So that's the difference between the two cases. The case of interior solution, you would not expect to find that the timing of the shock has an effect on the saving behavior. It's just the magnitude of the shock, but not the timing of the shock.
Also, Slobodan, both proposition one holds for both the corner.
It holds for both, yes.
For both the corner solution and the interior solution case.
Right. It's not as clear that the conditions that are a little more strict for the corner solution, we need just theta less than 1. For the interior solution, we need more strict conditions to hold. Okay.
So could you maybe look at this heterogeneity results? I mean, in a way to assess even further whether the model is
actually, because we look at the interactions by years to retirement, so probably that gets close to what you have in mind, because as years to retirement decreases, we are getting close, we are approximating the case of corner solution. So as years to retirement gets lower, we are basically more in the corner solution case. We are more likely to be in the corner solution case.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Murat. But then if you approach retirement, also the fraction of migrants who would want to stay permanently presumably increases. So doesn't that interfere if you keep these in the sample?
That's also true, but if we probably my answer would be if we look at here samples D and E as well as low levels of retirement, then maybe we can get even closer to that. Yeah, you're also right that probably the fraction of stayers, quote, the fraction of stayers is also increasing in that case. Yes. Okay, so let me quickly jump into the results. So it's a bit complicated. The first panel shows the 3 key variables of interests, and the second panel just PPP by itself. In different columns, in different panels, we have different samples. Moving from left to right, we increase the return intention intensity. So for instance, in columns 5 and 6, we have the sample with return intentions more than 20% of the time. Here we have more than 60% of the time. So let's first look at column 1. We find a positive effect of exchange rates on savings and a negative effect of home country prices on savings, which is in line with proposition 1. Quantitatively, we find that the elasticity of savings with respect to exchange rate is 0.43. In other words, if the exchange rates were to increase by 100%, which happened in Turkey, we would expect savings to increase by 43%. In other words, somebody who was saving 100 euros in Germany would instead save 143 euros. If we look at second column, we are basically testing proposition 2. Now we have the interactions with years to retirement. And again, in accordance with proposition 2, we see that the coefficient of the interaction coefficient of exchange rate is negative, and the interaction coefficient of home country price is positive. So this is also in line with the theoretical implications proposition 2. Okay, quantify this, we're going to look at a different table. And in addition to that, as we increase return intentions from column 1 to column 9, what we see that both statistical significance of the findings and the coefficient magnitudes increase. Okay, so if you look at samples with very strong return intentions, elasticity reaches, the elasticity of savings with respect to exchange rate reaches unity. Okay, this is also provide further evidence to our model because our model is people with strong return intentions. Finally, the results are robust if you just use PPP, not the elements of the PPP variable.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Yeah, so in the second panel, in panel B, so you play with the time to retirement, but you have a bunch of households that have no intention to return to their country. And if I read the table correctly, it should be 2,500 minus 1,000. So basically, is it right? So you have a huge proportion of households that do not intend to return, no?
I mean, intentions to return also change over time.
But the proportion of households that say repeatedly, we do not want to return to your country. So basically, for these migrants, I mean, time to retirement should not matter. So to what extent, so maybe something that could be useful is that you could isolate this household and do a placebo with them. And basically your interaction term in the second line of panel B shouldn't come out.
Actually, yeah. I mean, from these findings, I would expect that placebo to work because, from column 1 to column 9, the coefficients really increase, right? That means that the coefficient for the stayers, again, parentheses stayers, should be much lower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was a little bit surprised to see some result in column 2 because basically the proportion of households not intending to return is huge. I mean, it's more than 50%. So, but okay.
Johan?
Just a quick, just a quick question. So if you substitute savings by income in this table, do you obtain essentially zeros in the regressions or?
Actually, mostly zeros. I can show it at the end. We check whether there's an effect via household income. Okay, in one case, we get a positive significance.
I mean, there could be, because they're endogenous labor supply decisions.
There could be, but the elasticity is much, much lower compared to these numbers. The other thing is we check our robustness using saving rate as a control variable. And in that case, the results are robust as well when we use saving rate. And finally, you know, if we worry about the endogeneity of household income, if we drop household income from the list of control variables, the results are robust as well.
Okay, thanks. On Michelle's point, I guess even immigrants who do not intend to return, they may be sending remittances, right? So you may find some stars somewhere.
But yeah, I mean, in this data set, we can also know remittances for the purpose of savings. That's also small. But obviously, remittances for consumption could also be affected by these. Okay, that's something that we also look at. But my response to Michelle's question would be that, again, these numbers, even though these numbers are big, it's just driven by people who have strong return intentions. Even if the sample includes a lot of stayers, they are basically driven by the strong coefficients of smaller group of returners.
Excuse me, I also have a small clarification question on how you calculate the shares of time return intention. So is it with respect to the past responses at the time of survey, or is it about the whole observation time, including
it's whole observation time?
Okay, thanks.
I mean, theoretically there could be issues with that, but empirically I don't think that it wouldn't change much whether you take the past or the whole. Technically, you're right that it would be better if you used past, but empirically I don't think that would really make much of a change. So here, we look at the joint coefficients from the even numbered columns, okay, to see how the effects change by years to retirement. What we find is that the effects persist until years to retirement value of 20 years. And what we find is that for somebody with 20 years to retirement, the elasticity is about 0.45. Whereas somebody just before retirement, the elasticity is much higher, about 1.3. We do a number of robustness checks because of the time. We look at several estimators. We look at several alternative samples. The results are robust. We also do a lot of other robustness checks, including different control variables. We had country-specific time trends in case the parallel trend assumption across countries do not hold. We use alternative dependent variables in the form of dummy variable for savings or saving rate. Again, results hold. As Juan asked, we look at the potential effects via household income, and we also look at the potential correlation between attrition, because attrition could also be related to our key variables of interest. But basically, our results show no evidence of major worries in these dimensions. Finally, we look at heterogeneity in the effects by certain country level and individual level characteristics. Here, the blue lines and the circles show the case where the dummy variable takes the value of 1. Triangles shows the case where the dummy variables take the value of 0. As many of you guessed at the beginning, the results are stronger for households from guest worker countries. Okay, the effects are stronger for those households, and the effects seem to be stronger for male household heads who are older and who have family in their home country. To conclude, as Slobodan showed, we first look at a model in which individuals households revise their optimal savings decisions in response to exchange rate and home country price shocks. And we find that savings increase in the exchange rate, but decreases in the price level. Further, we look at how these findings change by time to retirement, and we find that the responses of savings exchange rate and home country prices become stronger as time to retirement becomes shorter. And we test these two propositions using a rich data set of immigrants in Germany. And our results confirm both propositions. And quantitatively, we find that the elasticity of savings with respect to the exchange rate is about 0.5 at 20 years to retirement. It increases all the way to 1.3 just before retirement. And using this peculiar information in this data set about willingness to return, we find stronger evidence for migrants with stronger willingness to return and for migrants from guest worker countries.
Thanks, Slobodan. The floor is now open to questions. We have approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Who wants to start? Dean, go on.
Thank you. Murat, Slobodan, thank you. Very exciting presentation. I'm wondering, sort of stepping back to the big picture here, when we think about migrants' life cycle decision-making and planning for retirement, obviously it's very natural for us to think immediately about savings plans and accumulation of savings, which you then, use during retirement. But I wonder, in the big picture, when we think about this group of migrants in particular, how do you think savings as a mechanism for life cycle planning and life cycle consumption and retirement compares to another plan, another approach that we often hear about, which is serial migration across generations? So I might go and work as a guest worker during my prime working years. During that time, instead of saving or alongside saving, I educate my children, get them higher levels of skill, improve their prospects for migration in the future, potentially in higher skilled occupations than I'm able to work in currently. And then I go home at retirement, at which point my children migrate and support me in retirement. So I think, I view this as a really intriguing, exciting new direction for research, which we haven't really explored as economists, as migration economists. And it's really highly, I think, a lot of my thinking has been sort of influenced by, working in the Philippine context, where you hear anecdotally about this kind of life cycle strategy a lot. It's not necessarily, even though savings is happening and people are accumulating savings and also assets like housing over the course of their migration spells overseas, they're also investing in their kids. And it's very common to see that when people retire, their kids then migrate and support them. So this is, going beyond your paper, but I'm wondering whether in this context, in this population, you think that's an important thing as well, and how that might compare to the savings mechanism that you've emphasized in this paper.
Okay.
Okay, if I may deal with the question, I think this saving behavior for generations in societies which are very tightly linked, where the household is looking after the following generations and the following generations are looking after the previous generations, that kind of a framework suggests that there is much less saving and a lot more investment going on, as a migrant would obviously invest in the children, expecting to get a much higher rate of return on the educational expenditures for the child than what he would get by making other investments. So in these tightly knit societies, I would expect that saving will be much lower. However, the effect of PPP should still be the same, in the sense that this lower saving rate abroad would tend to increase if the exchange rate were to move in favor of foreign currency. That is to say, there is going to be still the intertemporal consumption substitution between home and abroad, which is driving our results. You would have that also in your framework of analysis. But I would expect savings to be lower, but the impact to be in the same direction as suggested by our model. So that would be my answer to your question.
Also, maybe I might add a few things, Dean. I mean, for this group of immigrants, especially among the earlier ones in Germany, this savings motive was the stronger, I believe, was the stronger motivation than, let's say, human capital investment. Because one reason is that many of them, in fact, plan to come back. Actually, they overstayed, but it's an issue, for instance, about the Turks in Germany under education, because really they didn't put too much emphasis on this, let's say, as opposed to the immigrant context in the US, where fewer people plan to return. These people had very strong return intentions at first. So my understanding is that they placed much heavier emphasis in the accumulation of savings rather than in the accumulation of human capital compared to other contexts. So I think this context is a better context to study the savings behavior.
So I have a question that is partly related to what Dean was asking. So imagine that these households are also sending back remittances. So would an increase in remittances be represented as an increase in savings or a reduction in savings? So how is the question about savings actually framed?
Actually,
perhaps Murat can answer this, but my understanding is that the amount of funds which is being sent back to the country of origin can be of three different types. It could be either saving, remitting for the purpose of financing consumption of relatives. It could be remitting for the purpose of financing consumption of others, or it could be for the purpose of saving. So we do have the saving element in the remittances, which I think as a robustness check is being used by Murat to verify that the results are still robust.
Okay.
I don't know if Murat wants to add anything to this.
I mean, a few things like from the data, what we see is that we have rich data on remittances as well, Simone. Okay. And remittances is about like 20% of the total amount saved in Germany. And actually, most of the remittances are for family consumption, not for the purpose of asset accumulation. We can think of those remittances as consumption in our model, essentially.
Okay.
Actually, we also checked how these remittances respond to these key variables of interest. And we find just the opposite effects, like especially for recent migrants, like their remittances seem to fall in purchasing power parity. Like here, obviously, there are two opposing effects. If PPP goes up, basically family members can consume more by sending less. But at the same time, the substitution effect would be stronger. It seems that the first kind of income effect is stronger because sending less buys them more, and that effect dominates, especially for the recent group of immigrants. But as I said, in our model, we can just think about remittances as mostly consumption.
Got it. Thanks. And another question. I was thinking about things that can be correlated with years to return. And one is related to the question by Michelle. So you might, if you are very far from your time of retirement and hence time of return, a current variation in prices is unlikely to be relevant at that time. So in a sense, it's just that you don't expect it to last enough to influence your purchasing power when you're going to return. And the second thing that came to my mind is household composition. So when you are very far from retirement, probably you have children, and this means that your saving behavior and consumption choices are in a sense less flexible. You have an harder time adjusting your consumption level, and whether you might be capturing these in your interaction terms.
Slobodan, do you want to answer the first one?
Okay, I can address the first part of the question. When for the people who are just about to retire, our assumption of static expectations is much more relevant in the sense that the guy can expect in a couple of years to have that environment which is currently prevailing. But for somebody who's 30 years before retirement, 20 years to retirement, those changes in the exchange rate or the price level may be completely irrelevant because it's so far down the planning horizon. So that's a very good point that you're making, Simone. We agree. On the other point, I'll let Murat deal with that.
Yeah, actually, obviously, we agree that marginal utility of consumption is going to change in family composition, and we try to account for those things, using our control variables on family composition to the degree that we can.
Okay.
Yeah, I have another question on the model. So as it stands, no one would stay permanently in the host country, right? That is, if you wanted that in the model, you'd need some sort of location amenity, either complement the consumption or not. So do you have a sense of how your results carry through if there is anything in addition to consumption that it's either separable or not?
I didn't understand. If there's anything in addition to consumption, what in addition?
To consumption in the utility function, so something that would make you stay permanently in the host country.
That would make people stay permanently.
Yes.
I mean, if preferences were time varying, if there's a term for acclimatization to the host country, something like that could, explain a permanent stay, right?
Well, clearly somebody who develops a relationship with a native of the host country and has a spouse who is a native of the host country, that may pull the migrant to remain in the host country, especially if there are children who are growing up in the host country. Those factors, family relations, can obviously play an important role in influencing the decision whether or not to stay permanently. So I think that will be probably the dominant factor, whether or not the migrant marries a native of the host country and has a family with that native. That will be one of these factors that would result in permanent migration, other than obviously prices and exchange rates and things.
Sure,
like that.
but do you have a sense of whether the results then still carry through if you do have that?
Well, if you have, for permanent migrants, what happens to the purchasing power parity becomes irrelevant, other than if the migrant has some links back in the country of origin and cares for relatives that he sends remittances to, and in that case, the purchasing power of those remittances may play a role in the migrant saving decisions. But given that these remittances are relatively small in relation to the migrant's income, I would say that this would have a very small effect. So the more permanent is the stay of a migrant, the less effect purchasing power parity changes will have on the saving behavior of that individual.
No, that's sure. But if there is some other factor, then also for those who would plan to return, those factors would play a role, right? They might not be as strong to make you stay permanently, but if there is something else in the utility function, that would also play a role for those returning. So someone planning to return could still marry, but that but might respond differently to changes in prices and exchange rates. That's what I always had in mind.
Right, I agree that there would be a different response. Yes.
Okay, so it's 6:31. I'm gonna call the day. Thanks to Slobodan and Murat for their presentation, and to all of you for a number of interesting comments and questions. Have a nice day, and see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Bye.